begin. My name is Robert Myers. I'm the director of the Center for American Studies and Research. Thank you all for coming this evening to this talk. The one thing that I would remind you of is if you're not on our mailing list and you'd like to be, you can go to CASAR's website at AB and just add your name to our list to make sure that you get notifications of our future events. The other thing I would remind you of, this will be the last event of this semester. In February, among other things, we'll be having a composer named Laura Kaminsky, whose opera on with a transgender protagonist is the first such opera that's been done in the U.S. She's also a composer, she's done many other things. We'll have a celebration of, if that's the word, the 50-year anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X by looking from a number of perspectives at Malcolm X and his engagement with this part of the world. And there'll be a number of cultural and political talks, events, plays, whatever, all spring. So if you're not on our list, please get on it. And we'd love to see you come to some of those events too. So let me introduce tonight's guest. His name is David Shumway. He's an old friend and extraordinarily talented writer and critic. He's a professor of English and literary and critical studies at Carnegie Mellon University, where he's taught courses in film, literature, and cultural studies since 1985. He's the founding director of the Humanities Center at Carnegie Mellon, which is our own AHI here is an attempt to create such a center here, our Arts and Humanities Initiative. The treasurer of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. He served as the first president of the Cultural Studies Association, and he was the president of the Midwest Modern Language Association. He's written a number of books, including Michel Foucault. In 1989, he was one of the first to recognize the significance of Foucault in the United States. His next book, Creating American Civilization, A Genealogy of American Literature as an Academic Discipline, which is very close to what we do in American Studies. Again, a very prescient book. Modern Love, Romance, Intimacy, and the Marriage Crisis in 2003. Then in 2012, he wrote a book on the film director I and many others think is the most interesting and significant American film director, John Sayles. And his most recent book, which is going to be the topic of tonight's talk, which is called Rock Star, The Making of Musical Icons from Elvis to Springsteen, which was just published by Johns Hopkins University Press. It has chapters on Elvis Presley. He gave me his last name. He went Elvis, and then, just in case I didn't know, Presley.
You high culture types, you have to be.
Well, actually, I noticed that the fake Levi jeans on Abdulaziz up here, I looked. You know, they look like Levi jeans, and I realized that they, in this beautiful dyslexic ways, they're called Elvis jeans. Right? So Elvis Presley, James Brown, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, Grateful Dead, Joni Mitchell, and Bruce Springsteen. There are chapters on all of them in this new book. So that's what he'll be talking about. The way that he described it is the following. My book, Rock Star, The Making of Cultural Icons, from Elvis to Springsteen, investigates rock stars, the successor to the movie stars of an earlier era, as political figures, icons of cultural change, though not always progressive, whose public personas I read as collaboratively produced text. But the age of the rock star seems to be behind us, as a fragmented mediascape, declining sales, and the rise of the downloaded track mean that the broad reach these stars once had is no longer possible. While this may enable more different musicians to be heard, it will make them less listened to, because stardom is one condition of listening that encouraged attention and repetition. Please welcome David Shumway, who will talk about rock stardom and listening. Thank you.
to do this evening is to talk for about 2/3 of my time about what I've said in the book, and then I'm going to move on to the last third to spin out some new material on this issue of listening, which I don't take up directly in the book, but I think is a very interesting problem raised by what I see as the decline of the rock stardom and these changes in media that Robert just described. So what the book begins by trying to think about what it means that we move from an image of stardom that looks like this, that's Cary Grant, to one that looks like this. Cary Grant was probably certainly one of the leading icons of the culture from the late 30s through at least around 1960, if not longer. But by 1970, he had been replaced, in most people's estimation, by Mick Jagger as a kind of leading star. The rock star had replaced the movie star. And as journalist Robert Greenfield said in about 1971 or so, a new kind of star had come along. And so it wasn't just that one media replaced another, but stardom itself had changed. Movie stars were mainly understood in terms of their personalities. So they were distinct personality types. Greta Garbo here was the inscrutable siren. Humphrey Bogart was the man of honest commitments, the kind of ordinary guy caught in often unordinary circumstances. Cary Grant, the sophisticated bon vivant, and so on. The reason that personality was so important in the 20s and 30s is that it was actually a new idea. We take personality for granted now. We might even think it's kind of outmoded and have replaced it with other terms. But before the 20th century, the word character was the primary name for the way people presented themselves to the world. And character was understood primarily as something that you inherited. You were born with character. You might be able to improve it a bit if you were educated in the right way, but basically you either had it or you didn't have it. And of course there were lots of classist and racist assumptions entailed in that idea. Personality comes along and it basically assumes that people can present themselves any way they want to, that you can learn how to present yourself well. And in fact, a major bestseller in American history is the kind of based on that idea. It's a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, one of the most important self-help books in American history. Movie stars are also rooted in this idea. They were understood as particularly successful instances of personality. These people really knew how to sell themselves. They put themselves over in pleasing, charismatic ways. So that's what they were known for. They did not, in the main, have any political significance. In fact, and the studios worked really hard to keep controversies out of the newspapers. There were a whole publicity apparatus that controlled how these stars were perceived or understood. But after World War II, things begin to change. Movie stars and popular culture all of a sudden become more politicized. And this happens despite the fact that there is in the United States at that time a great push to try to keep controversial political views, especially left-wing ones, out of the media. But it backfires. It does, of course, keep left-wing views out of the media, but it also makes the media seem more political because people keep talking about this threat of communism. And because people keep talking about it, people start paying attention to the politics of the media in the way they hadn't before. John Wayne started acting in the 1920s, but he didn't become a star of the first magnitude until 1948. The same year, he declared himself an active anti-communist. After he portrayed a bunch of 19th century soldiers, but the key role for his political status was as Sergeant Stryker in the Sands of Iwo Jima, where, as Gary Wills said, he kind of entered the right wing's mythology of America. And what he does is he comes to stand for a certain vision of America that lasts 20 years after he died. John Wayne remained the most popular movie star in many polls for nearly 20 years after his death. And it's primarily because of the politics he represented rather than because people thought he was such a great actor. Now, at the same time, John Wayne, or almost at the same time, John Wayne becomes this representative of sort of right-wing American values, James Dean emerges to represent something that's not explicitly an alternative, but which is disruptive nonetheless. Dean only appeared in 3 movies. He died very young. He crashed his Porsche into a wall, which is almost a perfect representation of what he meant to people. He lived fast and he died young. He was the perfect incarnation of the young rebel, and of course his most famous film today is Rebel Without a Cause, which is based on a serious book about juvenile delinquency, but which was turned into a story about a middle-class kid whose parents have problems relating to him psychologically. It's kind of a deeply Freudian movie. And so the James Dean character rebels, and he embodies rebellion. And as Lee Medavoy's argued, this worked both with American Cold War politics, but against the kind of conformity of 50s culture. So on the one hand, America portrayed itself as rebellious. Whereas the communists kept individuals down, our people were allowed to be rebels. We were better than they were. On the other hand, Dean embodied juvenile delinquency, which was a big threat in this movie anyway. It was a big threat in the 50s. People were worried because kids were not obeying the law, they were getting arrested. So this dual character, a rebel, but also what he comes to represent is teenagers as a identity category, which is a new thing. The word teenager in English has almost no usage before World War II. It emerges in the later 40s and explicitly in a political context. The person who first defined the term understood teenagers as a group of people who felt they were denied their rights. And that's in a certain way the character Dean portrayed. Now, James Dean is the most important precursor for Elvis Presley. Rebel Without a Cause appears in 1955. In 1956, Elvis Presley becomes a superstar. And he does so by embodying the kind of rebellion that Dean did, but in a way which is, in some respects, more palatable, not quite so explicitly confrontational. As it turns out, however, Elvis's persona in the long run will actually be more controversial than Dean's. So I'm going to play a clip here of Elvis performing on the Milton Berle show in the summer of 1956, and this is the performance which really made Elvis Presley a figure of controversy and a superstar, both at the same So this show was watched by a percentage of the population that rivals today only events like the Super Bowl. There were only 3 TV networks in the United States in 1956. And so if one show happened to have somebody who was particularly interesting, that show might capture a significantly high percentage of the audience, as this performance did. Elvis was on TV, national TV, 12 times in one year in 1956. And TV has a really important role in making him a major star. It's because people could see him, in addition to hear his music on the radio, that he broke out of the pack and became the king of rock and roll, as he came to be called. Now, this performance illustrates 3 challenges that Elvis had or made for the established social order. In the first place, he was famously a white singer who sounded black. Elvis challenged the separation of races, the assumption that black and white were antithetical to each other. They were not alike or could be or should be blended in any way. He was in fact accused of mongrelizing culture, as anybody who socially engaged African Americans was at the time. The white people had imitated African Americans for centuries, at least, and the minstrel show in American culture is the most famous instance of this. But the minstrel show was mockery. It was very clear that Elvis was not mocking African Americans, but paying homage to them. And that threatened white supremacy. And as a result, white citizens' councils in the South held protests to burn his records and accused him of being a communist, because of course anybody who favored social equality for African Americans or acted as if he might was clearly a communist. Secondly, Elvis's dress in that clip, though it perhaps today does not look to us unusual, was significantly dressed down for a TV appearance. When Frank Sinatra or Bing Crosby appeared on TV, they wore tuxedos. Elvis always appeared to be the working class kid he was. He's described in his biography as the son of a common laborer from Tupelo, Mississippi. And he basically never became, despite the wealth that he acquired, a person with bourgeois habits or tastes. He always remained working class. That was a new thing in American popular culture, although you might have seen some of it in country music circles, but those people had never broken out to the major audience. Elvis brought class in people's faces in a way that it hadn't been before. Finally, and perhaps least obviously, Elvis's performance here challenges gender hierarchies, because Elvis in this clip, his dancing, clearly displays his body as a sexual object. Men did not do that except in very subtle ways in the 1950s. That was the thing that outraged commentators most about this performance. They likened him to a striptease dancer or a burlesque show. And there were tons of complaints about this. In particular, I think that the brief clip of the young girl enacting a kind of ecstasy watching this was what was most threatening. Because not only did Elvis himself seem to be behaving like a woman, that is, not a real man, but this performance was also understood to be affecting women in ways that was dangerous. And that trope, the cutting back between the performance and the female spectator, will be repeated over and over again once the Beatles get to the United States in the early 1960s. It becomes just the standard way that these concerts are photographed. Before this, it's relatively unusual for a camera to cut away to the audience during a musical performance on television. So Elvis was controversial for reasons that are politically significant. He contributed very strongly to a growing sense of generational identity. Todd Gitlin, now a sociologist, but in the 60s, a member of the Students for a Democratic Society, the leading US New Left organization, said that Elvis named us a generation. It was around him that people of that age group came together and first thought of themselves as different than their parents. Elvis was not Frank Sinatra or Bing Crosby. He represented something that was then understood to be radically new. So I'm going to move on now to talk about, I'm going to talk about all of the figures in my book, but I'm going to focus on two more of them. One of them is James Brown, and the other is going to be the Grateful Dead. James Brown actually started performing before Elvis Presley did, in the early 1950s. And he began in a period when the music industry in the United States was largely segregated. There were a few performers like jazz greats Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong who could perform in integrated venues in the North and who did appear on TV. But in the South, either in bigger places there were separate shows for blacks and whites, in smaller places there were segregated seating arrangements. Brown performed on what was called the Chitlin Circuit, which was a circuit of venues traveled by black performers who played for both whites and blacks, but which was completely segregated. There were no white performers on the Chitlin Circuit. And it was largely cut off from the rest of America. People who performed on it might record what were called then R&B records. There was a separate chart for these records. They were understood to be sold pretty much exclusively to African Americans. Now, rock and roll began to change that. Rock and roll started to make white listeners aware of this music and started to buy it. James Brown, however, remained largely someone who was listened to by African Americans until the early 60s. One of the important things that happened is he recorded a live album, Live at the Apollo, which was one of the first live albums to be recorded in popular music. It was a new idea. In fact, his record company wouldn't pay for it. He had to use his own money to make this record because King Records couldn't see why anybody would buy records that they had already heard once again. It turned out to be a smash hit. And it helped put James Brown in front of a national audience. Then he recorded a song that people heard as radically new. That song is often argued is the kind of beginning of funk. James Brown is the most sampled musician in the history of hip hop, and it's because he created a kind of raft of licks that began with Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, which transformed the way R&B music was played and performed. Brown said that what was significant about this song is that the emphasis is on the one. Instead of the downbeat, which is the traditional emphasis in most jazz and rock and roll, you hear that punch, Papa. It hits it in a new way. It's a rhythm that Brown probably learned from a jazz drummer sometime previous and then figured out how to incorporate it into the song. And then he continued to produce new, complicated polyrhythms that distinguished him from basically everyone else. So aesthetically, he triumphs. But for my story, what's more important is that he becomes a leader. He becomes understood not merely as a musician, but a race man, as they were called, a leader of the black people. And this leadership stems mainly from one event which occurred in the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968. Brown was scheduled to play a concert in Boston, and it was going to be the night after King had been killed. The authorities wanted first to cancel the show because they were worried that a lot of African American kids in one place might produce trouble. But Brown and some of his people recognized that that would be the stupidest thing to do, because not only would people be disappointed that he wasn't playing, but they wouldn't have any place to go. So it was determined that what ought to happen is that they ought to televise the concert for free and basically give everybody something to do that night. And that's what happened. Brown had to get a little bit of extra money in order to allow the thing to be televised, and he didn't want to be taken advantage of. He was always a shrewd businessman. But he was very willing to go along with this once the financial arrangements had been worked out. And so this is a little clip from that, that evening.
I'd like to bring now the man whose foresight and leadership has given the city of Boston and the whole metropolitan Boston area a new lease on life. He's a man who's young. He's a man who cares. He's going to make this a great city. The Honorable Mayor. President Stardom for blessed evening, and I said to Honorable Mayor, he said, look, man, I said, if you come down and listen, I'm all together. And this is a swinging kid. Okay? Mayor, right, people get down with all that. Now, he's a swinging kid. Thank you, Tom, James. All of us are here tonight to listen to a great talent, James Brown. But we're also here to pay tribute to one of the greatest Americans, Dr. Martin Luther King.
So there was many American cities burned in the days after Martin Luther King was killed, but Boston had no significant civil unrest. James Brown was given credit for that. Now, of course, you can't prove a negative. We don't know what would have happened had James Brown not been there. But nonetheless, James Brown was given credit, and as a result, he became understood as a significant black leader. In 1969, Look magazine could ask, it's hard to read there, but it says, is he the most important black man in America? Now, one way to look at that is that some of the most important black men in America were dead by then, unfortunately. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, some others who were lesser known. But it's still a remarkable thing to say about someone who might have been called a few years earlier a mere entertainer. About the same time, James Brown released a hit single called Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. It was his first explicitly pro-civil rights or pro-black power song, and it attracted a lot of attention and a lot of sales. Unfortunately, after that, relatively quickly, Brown's role declined. He continued to be active. This is with Julian Bond, who was the first African American elected to the Georgia legislature. He appeared with Muhammad Ali, who was at that time a draft resistor. So this is a political statement to appear with the greatest. But unfortunately, he also tended to appear with lots of people who represented different values. First, he was with Vice President Hubert Humphrey. James Brown, at Humphrey's, because of Humphrey's intervention, went to Vietnam to entertain the troops, something that Brown felt very passionate about wanting to do. But then he became a supporter of Richard Nixon, who's in that second picture there, because he said Nixon supported black capitalism, which is kind of an odd thing because, of course, the Democrats weren't opposed to black capitalism either. And in fact, someone has said that probably Brown was willing to support Nixon because Nixon asked him to, and Brown was always happy to when white leaders, or leaders of any kind, paid attention to him. Then we see him with Ronald Reagan, who he also supported, and then George W. Bush, and finally Colin Powell, one of the architects of the Iraq wars. So Brown's political role changed. He became a kind of establishment figure. And unfortunately also he had personal problems. He was arrested for not paying taxes. He lost most of his business empire. He got into drug difficulties. He went to jail twice, but he always rose again. And by the time of his death in 2007, he was back filling stadiums, or basketball arenas anyway. And still dancing, even though he was, a very old man. Bob Dylan's trajectory moves from politics to art. And the role that he plays in my book is that I argue that he's the one who, more than anyone else, made rock and roll understandable as art, as an aesthetic object. So this is a picture from a benefit he did for the Congress of Racial Equality, a civil rights organization. You see him dressing the part. He's wearing a work shirt. He's playing an acoustic guitar. And he was singing songs at that time which were explicitly protest songs. Songs like The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, or Only a Pawn in Their Game, or most famously Blowing in the Wind, which became an anthem of the civil rights movement. But within a few years, Dylan had changed both his music and his appearance. He became a rock star. That rock stardom started with this song. Like a Rolling Stone. And Dylan styled himself explicitly in terms of the artist, as the artist had developed into the period of modernity. He likened himself in songs and in other writings to Rimbaud, to Verlaine, to Pound, to Picasso, to Stravinsky. He presented himself as someone who was doing in the same business as they were. And partly because he began as a folk musician singing these songs about current events, people took this seriously. It's also partly because he wrote great lyrics and interesting music. And he, of course, remains a compelling figure today. In 1964, the Beatles invaded the United States. They increased the rock and roll audience almost overnight. Elvis basically had only attracted teenagers. College students expressed no interest in Elvis. It was different with the Beatles. They immediately attracted people from a relatively wide range. Young people from their preteens to 20s, like the Beatles. The Beatles dark others were the Rolling Stones. And if you think about these two pictures, almost perfectly illustrate the differences. The Beatles were almost always photographed smiling. The Stones never were. The Beatles sang happy songs about love. The Stones sang songs about frustration and unhappy relationships primarily. The opposition continued to oscillate throughout the 60s, but when the Beatles broke up at the end of the decade, the Stones had the stage to themselves. They were called the world's greatest rock and roll band, and there really wasn't anyone in the early 70s to challenge that. But they became at that time associated very strongly with excess. And a couple of images here. This is Mick Jagger from a film role he was in, the film Performance. And you'll notice that there's excessive sex here. Two at a time is more than usual. There's also some suggestion of homoerotic relationships in the film, so that could be regarded as excessive, especially then. And here we have, into that picture. Goodness. It was very strange. The slide just disappeared. We had a picture of Mick smoking a joint in the back of a Rolls Royce. It was from Vogue. So what happens with the Stones is that they become the kind of poster children for this new conception of stardom, which is identified not with sophistication or glamour, but with excess, with breaking the rules, with doing everything, more of everything. And that, of course, is a perfect representation of what consumer capitalism is all about. Consumer capitalism tells you that you might, to paraphrase one of the Stones songs, you might be able to get what you need, but you always want more of it. And that's, the Stones illustrated that. So although they were always a rebellious lot and they broke a lot of rules, my own view of them is that they are rather more expressive of the dominant than of the opposition. That brings us to the Grateful Dead, who I think are the Stones' opposite in this regard. The Grateful Dead represent utopianism. Their great promise is transformation. They emerged out of a genuine counterculture, a set of alternative institutions that had been created in the San Francisco Bay Area, which included the San Francisco Mime Troupe, a street theater troupe with explicitly political goals. The Diggers, a radical group named after a 17th century sect in England that opposed private property. The Diggers started free stores where you could go and get stuff for free. They gave things away. And there were other institutions. So the counterculture was not just an idea in San Francisco. When the Dead emerged, it was real. And in fact, the most important institution that for them were Ken Kesey's acid tests, a series of parties when the then legal drug, LSD, was put into vats of Kool-Aid, and anybody who wanted to could come and get high and experience a kind of multimedia art show. And the Dead were the principal performers there. Jerry Garcia said of these events, there was nothing greater for a musician because they didn't have to be good, they didn't have to play songs. In fact, they didn't even have to play if they didn't want to. They were completely free to experiment. And this is a perfect instance, a perfect example of what the Dead were like, because they were an experimental band for their entire lives. In fact, the soul of their performance was that you never knew what was going to happen. They never knew what was going to happen from concert to concert. They never played the same set list twice. Their ethos was to transform the space in which they played into something like a quasi-religious setting. I've described their concert pacing as liturgical. Even though they never played the same songs in the same order or the same songs every time, there was a pacing to the concert that was actually based on some sense of the rhythm of a trip. And the idea was that you took the audience through this quasi-trip, whether the audience was tripping or not. You gave them the experience of it by presenting the music in a certain way. And Garcia called this a seat-of-the-pants shamanism. Both the band and the audience wants to be transformed by the experience. The Dead were later accused of being near hippies, of not having any politics, but they were in fact the band most supportive of genuine radical events. They did all kinds of benefits. And here's an example of one. This is from the Columbia student strike of 1968. They had to sneak the band onto campus in a bread truck. And that song they were playing is called The 11. It's in 11/4 time, which is those non-musos here, not a normal time signature. 11 beats to the measure is quite unusual. And it's an example. The Dead actually had two members who were trained in conservatory at that time. One of them, Tom Constantin, dropped out early on, but Phil Lesh continued to the end. So there was a kind of some serious music stuff in their background. This is a picture from the MIT student strike in 1970 after the bombing of Cambodia and the killings at Kent State. I'll move along here. The Dead created were very strongly associated with psychedelic visual imagery. This is the cover of their third album named Oxamoxa, and it's a kind of allegory of death and rebirth, which another sort of idea of transformation or metamorphosis. So then, Joni Mitchell, I talk about in terms of bringing a genuinely feminine or female perspective to rock music. In the early 70s, she was called rock's leading lady. Really, the only rival in the early 70s would have been Janis Joplin, who unfortunately died too young. But the difference between Janis Joplin and Joni Mitchell is that Janis Joplin presented herself mainly for men. She was a kind of incarnation of a certain male fantasy of a woman. And she adopted male rock star habits, drinking too much, cursing. She tried to be one of the boys in addition to wanting to be loved by the boys. Mitchell, on the other hand, worked really hard to sing about the world from the perspective of her experience as a woman. And she developed a confessional stance. She and James Taylor helped to start the singer-songwriter movement, and that movement was defined by this idea that the singer is bearing his or her soul to you, singing autobiographically, whether or not the lyrics are true is irrelevant. What's important is that they are sung as if they are autobiographical. They are presented in an autobiographical form. And Mitchell was the best, strongest illustration of this confessional stance, especially on her album Blue, which was the first album which is entirely composed, filled with confessional songs. The word confessional was taken from a school of poetry that was popular at the time, whose leading practitioners included Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, and Anne Sexton. And Plath and Sexton were both understood by the women's movement as important spokespeople for feminism. Now, Mitchell has always rejected that connection to them, but I think it's real even if she had never read them. Finally, Bruce Springsteen brings together rock and roll's politics in many respects. His first major hit record, Born to Run, he makes a statement by posing with Clarence Clemens, an African-American member of his band. This may not seem radical today, but in the early 70s it was quite unusual. Later, Springsteen changed his look, moved from a kind of bohemian appearance to a distinctly working class one. He played, as in this last picture, distinctly working class roles in several videos from the album Born in the USA, made by John Sayles. And he continues to embody this notion of the ordinary man. This is a very recent photo. Continues to, of course, attract enormous audiences worldwide. The key moment for Springsteen is that he performed in 2008 at the concert for Barack Obama's inauguration with Pete Seeger. And they sang Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. Now, Pete Seeger was blacklisted in the 1950s as a communist. And he was a communist. He wasn't unfairly blacklisted, if you think black communists should be blacklisted. He was really a communist. The fact that Springsteen could appear together with Seeger to celebrate the inauguration of the first black president is a significant moment in American political history, I think. Especially because they were singing this song, which is in fact a hymn against private property. At least, most people don't know that about the song. Lyndon Johnson, in fact, said it should be the national anthem, but he'd never heard all the verses. So here I'm going to move then to my coda about listening. And unfortunately I don't have such good pics for this, so you have to watch this image of somebody listening to a concert in the late 60s while I read this part. What's significant about the role that Springsteen played and many of these other people that I've talked about is that Greta Garbo or Humphrey Bogart could not have done so even at the height of their careers. The point is that this cultural field of rock and roll, in this cultural field of rock and roll, star personas were assumed to mean something politically. These stars mattered not only to their fans, but also to many who knew them through the news media as signs of cultural conflict to be welcomed or feared. But as my conclusion asserts, the age of rock stars seems to be behind us. A fragmented mediascape, declining sales, and the rise of the downloaded track mean that the broad reach these stars once had is no longer possible. While this may enable more different musicians to be heard, it will make them less listened to. I want to explore the hypothesis that stardom is one condition of listening that encouraged attentive listening. When a fan forms a relationship with a star, the emotional bond entails more sustained attention. Moreover, it will encourage attention not just to a particular song or album, but to any recording the star might release. While one certainly can listen with attention to a piece of music without any context at all, I'm suggesting that listening through stardom enriches the experience. Most popular music today is consumed distractedly, and this has probably been the case at least since the rise of radio, allowed music to become a constant background. without any attention on the part of the listener once the set had been turned on and a station tuned in. Prior to the LP, playing records required frequent attention, since 78 RPM recordings played only for about 3 minutes. The concert as an event, where the performance of music is presented as the center of an audience's attention, seems to have been an innovation of the middle 17th century. Before that, music would have been associated with dance and drama, and afterward it would continue to be played in non-concert settings where people could afford to hire musicians for the purpose. Think of the period movies you've seen where string quartets play in the background while rich people mingle or dance. This is a legitimate picture of how music was used in previous times. It is clear that the piano and other instruments that found their way increasingly into the home in the later 19th century required the attention of the players, but did not necessarily require that of others within hearing. Still, it is likely that occasions for making live music did encourage more attention than did the playing of recorded music. What I'm suggesting here is that even though distracted listening is not new, as the prevalence of music increased, attention to it decreased. Recent technological innovations, the MP3 player, musical downloads, cloud music, etc., have made music even more available. But even before the digital age, elevator music was already everywhere, prompting comic writer Fran Lebowitz to complain in the 1970s that music should know its place. Anahid Kasabian has dubbed the situation we currently find ourselves in as one of ubiquitous music and ubiquitous listening. Her recent book tries to think about what it means that we now live in a world where music is omnipresent. Marta Garcia Quinones describes the typical experience of music under these conditions as distracted listening. She observes that, quote, attentive concert-like listening is still recognized as paradigmatic. Paradigm music is an interesting neologism. Paradigmatic by most music aficionados and critics, unquote, yet only a very small part of the music heard today is heard under concert-like conditions. John Mowat, in one of the first essays to try to address changing conditions of listening, observed that the debate between Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno was about distraction. Benjamin, in arguing for the potentially progressive character of mechanically reproduced art, as exemplified by silent cinema, held that its virtue was distraction. Adorno, in critiquing the fetish character of music in his era, was already complaining that listening was distracted, and that the serious attention that music deserved was rendered impossible by the repetition of popular songs and even the melodies of great composers. Where Benjamin associated the contemplative experience of art with its aura and with fascism, Adorno presents it as the only hedge against the culture industry. While Mowat's reading usefully treats these two figures dialectically, he, in my view, misses the different senses of distraction used by each. Benjamin was not arguing that viewers of Charlie Chaplin were watching him distractedly. Rather, he meant that they were distracted by Charlie Chaplin. Adorno, on the contrary, means precisely that listeners were distracted from the music they hear. Mowat sees both Benjamin and Adorno as contributing to a new realization of relations between listening and subjectivity, with both interested in the political implications of these relations. Kasabian believes that ubiquitous music and listening produce what she calls distributed subjectivity, the politics of which are implicitly progressive, but which she does not spell out. Where both Benjamin and Adorno attach moral judgments to their accounts of distraction, Kasabian does not. For her, distracted listening is a new reality she is trying to understand. The model of listening given to us by classical music as a practice, the model Adorno takes as his ideal, assumes more than mere attention. Listeners are presumed to know and follow the musical form that is being played for them. Movements, motifs, harmonic changes, etc. are supposed to be recognized and followed. My suspicion is that most of the audience for classical music no longer listens in this way. But even if I'm wrong, it is clear that listeners to other kinds of music certainly do not. There are other kinds of attention, however, as Ola Stockfeld observes when he argues that modes of listening develop in relation to different genres. When I was a teenager, I would often retreat to my bedroom and put on rock and roll loud enough to drown out all other sounds. I listened attentively enough, but I did not hear chord changes, rhythmic schemes, or bass lines. Rather, my attention was focused on the experience of the recording as a whole, the combination of music and lyrics, in most cases, that produced a unified intellectual and emotional response. This might be the mode of listening appropriate to rock in its first decade or so, when it was defined by top 40 radio. And yet, I did not always listen attentively in this situation. There were times that I read while the music was playing, and other times when I daydreamed. Even attentive listening, I would suggest, is only more or less intermittently so. My guess is that many people using MP3 players and earbuds today are listening with this sort of intermittent attention. Nick Bromell has described another mode of listening to rock, typical of college-age people of the late 1960s, living to music, a phrase he borrows from contemporary writer John Connick, and this is a long quote from Connick from 1967. I wake up in the morning and do the master's voice thing in front of the speakers for a while. Then I go outside. Music defines a total environment. Straight musicians understand, straight musicians here means those not doing drugs or not freaks. Straight musicians understand that kind of involvement, of course, but you can't really communicate to the outside how 100,000 children of Muzak freaks, who in most cases never bother to study or even think about music, are involved in a single art form to the point where they virtually stake their entire sanity on it. Go to a house and someone hands you a joint in front of a record player, and it's assumed that you're going to sit for a couple of hours, not talking, hardly moving, living to music, unquote. I lived through this experience of music also, which was different than that of my younger self. While I may not have tuned on music first thing in the morning, sitting for a couple of hours in front of a stereo is something I did regularly, both as an undergraduate and graduate student. Living to music does not represent the same kind of attention assumed in the classical model, but it also clearly is not distracted listening, but something rather like almost total absorption. As Bromell implies, this mode of listening is analogous to the experience of psychedelic drugs. The music becomes a springboard for an altered state of consciousness, and as such it opens out onto the world beyond the music. It altered perception in general, just as LSD did. The mode of listening was appropriate to the more complex rock ushered in by Dylan and the Beatles, beginning around 1965, which of course would include acid rock. My suggestion is that rock stardom was one of the conditions to make this kind of attention possible, even if it need not have been, and perhaps was not usually, the focus of this kind of listening. It's not just that every record played would have been by a star, since new sounds were always desired, but also that even stars' music would not necessarily have directed attention to its creators. Rather, my argument is that for music to matter this much, the stars had to come first. It was their cultural presence that made living to music plausible. Connick was writing in 1967, the year that saw the release of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Jimi Hendrix' Are You Experienced, and the Jefferson Airplane's Surrealistic Pillow. In the short time since the Beatles took America by storm in 1964, the place of music in American youth culture had been utterly changed, and it was the Beatles, the Stones, and Dylan who were mainly responsible for this. But what accounts for the Stars' importance to the experience of music? When I was 6 or 7, my best friend, who was a year older, took piano lessons. When he passed a milestone of some kind, he was given a bust of a famous composer, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, etc. I never envied him having to go to lessons or practice the piano, but I did covet these little white sculptures, even though I couldn't have named a single piece of music those composers had written. Why were these busts an appropriate reward, especially for students who at that age were unlikely to have much familiarity with classical music? I think it's because music, indeed art in general, is enriched by association with personality or subjectivity. It matters who makes something because we understand expression as personal. Things don't make art, people do. The busts help make abstract pieces sound personal. We are talking here about what Foucault called the author function. He famously proclaimed the author's disappearance and urged us to consider discourse in light of other considerations. Quoting Samuel Beckett, he asks, "What matter who is speaking?" Yet we should remember that despite his references to novelists and playwrights, Foucault's main interest was in serious discourse, the subject of the archaeology of knowledge on which he was working when What is an Author appeared. Science was for Foucault properly authorless discourse, since its statements hold regardless of who uttered them. But art does not consist of statements, and authors, despite various postmodern claims and artifices, have not disappeared any more than art's aura has. Rock stars are authors on steroids. When we listen to the music of the stars, we feel that we are in touch with someone whom we know. This feeling is, of course, imaginary, since we do not know the star the way we know our actual families, friends, or colleagues. But this is so much the better, since real people invariably disappoint us. Our experience of the personas of stars gives their music an emotional resonance that is lacking when a song is heard in the anonymity typical of downloaded singles. But the value of the relationship with the star is not just emotional. A new album by Dylan or Springsteen has the advantage of existing within an oeuvre with which their fans are intimately familiar. The new material is of some interest merely because it stands in relation to older recordings that matter to the listener. This does not necessarily mean that a fan will, in the end, regard the new material as a significant addition to the oeuvre, as the response to the Rolling Stones' later recordings illustrate. But it does, I think, suggest that fans will continue to listen with attention to the star's new work so long as they continue to expect that something significant might emerge. We have then, I believe, good reason to suspect that the era of rock stardom enabled a different kind of listening than was typical of popular music before it or very likely after it. The point is not that distracted listening is immoral or bad mental hygiene. Rather, my point is that attentive listening produces rewards that distracted listening cannot. Moreover, when listening is primarily experienced in the mode of distraction, it renders that music less intellectually significant. The music may still assert a powerful influence, but it does so in a way that will not be recognized by most listeners. Under these circumstances, popular music is almost certainly going to be understood as essentially trivial, returning to the role it was thought to hold until the rise of rock and roll. Thank you.
So please, we have time for a couple of questions. I'll start actually, and anyone can follow. I'd love you to address the extent to which this idea of a rock star or performer or star, as you constructed here, is very much an American construction, and how the fact that it's gone international is also part of this process of fragmentation. And I'm particularly interested in the extent to which there are a lot of people here from a drama class that I teach, American drama, and the last play that we looked at is a play called Ruined by Lynn Nottage. And unlike all of the other plays that we have read, which are about American experience, this is completely set in the Congo. All of the characters are Congolese except for a Lebanese, who's named Hariri. And so you suddenly get a different perspective of the world. And the reason I'm asking is when you put Dylan up, for example, I remember reading and being quite surprised, though I shouldn't have been, that he was really an ardent Zionist at the same time that he was, promoting civil rights in the South, for example. And that once you go kind of internationally with cultural politics, the example I would offer is We Are the World, right? is that suddenly it turns into something else, and a lot of us have naturalized these notions of personality, stardom, etc. from American categories, Hollywood, the culture industry, and therefore, some were from Great Britain, but overwhelmingly you talked about these American figures. So I just wonder what happens when these ideas go international, and whether that has happened. I know Peter Gabriel is a perfect example in the UK of somebody who's kind of made all of this world music. It seems it's quite unusual for an American to do this, though you may know of some.
So let me first by saying, Dylan was at some point in his career an ardent Zionist, but I don't think it was at the same time he was singing civil rights songs. I believe it occurred in the period after he was an evangelical Christian and before whatever he is now. So one of the things I didn't talk about is part of Dylan's persona is this notion that he's a trickster figure, a shapeshifter, because no one can predict where he's going to end up next, which you might think would render any of his particular personas suspect or not believable, but for some reason the sense of authenticity that he holds within him has survived all of that shape-shifting, so that he continues to tour and people still regard him as a very serious and still creative artist, very much unlike the Rolling Stones, who people regard as still fine musicians but no longer creating anything new. Now, the international thing is very interesting because, of course, there's a lot of evidence that rock and roll in the 60s carried this message of social and cultural change beyond the United States. So Tom Stoppard's play, Rock and Roll, illustrates its function in the Renaissance of the Czechoslovakia in 1968. As a kind of understood as a revolutionary music. Merely playing it was a challenge to the apparatchiks and the Soviets. But it's also clear that as the music becomes more institutionalized, it comes to seem, in general, less rebellious, less progressive. And that's partly why you have a series of attempts to reinvigorate that aspect of it. So punk is the first one, and then grunge 15 or so years later, really a revival of many of the same aesthetics. Dick Hebdige has written significantly about how punk itself is an international melange, that it requires Jamaican and West Indian music in its background to make sense. It comes out of the realization of an interracial Britain that is also an international Britain, because people of color in Britain were not understood to be Brits, but immigrants in a way that African Americans were not by the 20th century. It's certainly true that American cultural icons since Hollywood have had international meaning, and the cultural imperialism thesis begins really with American movies, which dominated the world market, and then continues to music. What's interesting about music, though, is that long before most of the world could have its own, most countries have their own film industries, they could make their own music. And so popular music actually, to my mind, illustrates the kind of resistance to cultural imperialism that's widespread, that people taking the components of music that they may have learned from American popular music and other European popular, but remaking it for their own purposes. So while I do think there are elements of sort of an Americanist perspective that are communicated by these stars and their music and other music too, I also think that people have made use of the form in ways that challenge the hegemony of the American culture and American business interests.
Well, thank you. Now that you said it, Bob Marley came to mind, and it's really a fascinating sort of figure to sort of reconfigure and think about your book in these international ways. So thank you. Please, other questions? We have time for a couple more.
Yes.
Would you say that the end of the rock star era is due to economic causes more than political causes? Because, like, we pretty much don't need political stars anymore. We need people to sell commodities, right? Which is pretty much what the cultural industry is all about.
Well, you know, Lenin said a capitalist will sell you a rope to hang him with. I've always thought he should have said Lenin will sell you a rope to hang another capitalist with. But a capitalist will sell you a rope to hang another capitalist with. The culture industry is happy to sell rebellion if it sells. The culture industry has no qualms about radical politics in general, as long as it's commercial. And it was commercial in the 60s, and it hasn't been, in general, commercial since maybe the early days of hip-hop, when there were lots of genuinely political music being made. But I think that the Planet Rockstar is much more economic, but the economics are not, it's not a conspiracy, it's technology and it's the changing market. It's just that, so stars are producers, they help produce their own personas, but they wouldn't be stars if there wasn't a media industry to help promote those personas. The industry does not have as much reason to make stars anymore. When I talk to my students about how they pick up music, it's seldom that they say, oh, well, I heard this person's record and I wanted to hear the next one. It's much more, I heard that record and I liked it, so I downloaded it. And I may or may not download the next record by that person. It will all depend on whether I like it when I hear it. Whereas in the 60s, people predictably bought the next record by the star, even if they didn't like it. I mean, you know, some bad records sold, you know, decent numbers of copies because they were by the right person. Yes.
I'm a serious Dead freak, and I just completed listening to every Grateful Dead concert from 1984, which is the first year I saw them. So in my life, it's kind of like before this one time and after. But I guess I have two questions, kind of about this. Why, I was born in '69, and most of the kids I knew in the 70s and 80s growing up, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, like very middle America kind of place, the suburbs. And most of us defined our psychology by the bands we liked. My mom and dad were born in the late 30s, so they were that silent generation. And when I talked to my mom, who is a church musician and a serious musician, but nobody amongst her friends or her really defined their personality by music they liked in the same way. So what was it about the way we grew up in the 70s and 80s that our we constituted our identities through liking these different bands?
So I don't think it's completely new. There's a scene in Blackboard Jungle where the teacher, played by Glenn Ford, brings his collection of 78 jazz records in to play for these delinquent kids in his technical high school. And the kids smash the records. That's the narrative focus of the scene. But what's clear is that this teacher defines his identity very much in terms of these jazz records. And David Reisman wrote an article before this movie came out exactly about that phenomenon. It came out in 1950
When was the
in American
movie?
Quarterly. So, but I think it's absolutely right to say that this was a minority phenomenon. They were aficionados, special people identified themselves by their music then. And it's in the 50s, it's with Elvis, when rock and roll marks this break, and it's a radical break. We like this stuff, we don't listen to Perry Como, we don't listen to Frank Sinatra anymore. And it really was, I mean, you liked one or the other, nobody liked both. Later people might have, when we grew up, we might have come to an appreciation of that older stuff. But at the time, it was a real cultural conflict. And it created this sense of youth identity. And it has defined rock and roll as youth music ever since. So another kind of bit of field work, talking to my students and listening to their music, the music they have in common is much of the music I'm talking about here. They listen to new music, but it's not the same. If I poll my students, they listen to 50 different kinds of music or 50 different artists, but they all know the Beatles and Eric Clapton and Led Zeppelin. They may not always like them, but they know them and they have this music in common.
So we have time for one more question if somebody has one.
I don't know if it's a question, but I'm very curious about your generation, my own kids, who, when they turn on the computer, they have 15 windows open at the same time. They're able to do it all in ways I could not possibly imagine. They listen to music while they're working out, but they're not necessarily distracted because they can repeat every single word of a rap song where lyrics are incredibly, you need to listen to the lyrics, and it's not like it's a story and you can easily pick it up. So you talked about technology, and I'm wondering about this generation, the generation of my kids, whose brains are also wired in ways that I certainly can't begin to comprehend, and wondering where the rock star and politics and cultural icons are there. So I don't know what this question is.
I'm a little skeptical
Multitasking, right?
I'm a little skeptical, in fact, that people are able to multitask in the way you're suggesting, that there isn't anything lost in that. There have been studies that I recently published that suggest that, in fact, there's significant degradation of quality of attention for people who are multitasking. So now it's clear that there are different approaches to the relationship of music and other kinds of thought processes. So there are some people, and in fact, there are studies that suggest that this correlates to introversion and extroversion, that extroverts need noise to work. And so music actually helps them focus by giving them the right kind of background. Whereas introverts find, if I'm remembering this study correctly, it could be the other way around, but anyway, the other people find that music to be a distraction. They can't work with the music. They need more peace and quiet. I know I'm like that. If there's music playing, I tend to pay attention to it and not to whatever else I'm supposed to be doing, unless it's a physical activity. I can wash dishes and listen to music, but I can't write and listen to music unless I'm writing about that music.
Well, I think that's it, unless there's another question. Yeah? We have another question?
Yeah.
Oh, Lynn had a question, yes.
There's an expression that says that the sincere imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Don't you think that Elvis Presley at that time, even though he tried differentiating between black music and white music, it is a sort of flattery. Perhaps he's a fan, and perhaps he took inspiration out of that.
I have no question in my mind that it was sincere flattery, sincere if he genuinely, but it was not just imitation. If you listen to Elvis's recordings of the African American songs that he first recorded for some records, like That's All Right Mama or Mystery Train, you compare them, It's clear that Elvis's interpretation is his own. He's not just imitating. But there's enough of the original that it's also clear where it comes from. So it's not like Pat Boone singing the same song where you would have no idea where it came from if you didn't know. And this is why it is, I think, it's possible to say, as Eric Lott did, that Elvis was engaged in love and theft, but you can't accuse him of just theft.